everybody for joining us. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Samantha. Welcome to this third talk in the Elevate Game Anglia program. So today we're going to talk about how to write for games and narrative design in and of itself. We have two amazing guests. Thank you so much for joining us. And yeah, let's start with the beginning. So how did you get into the games industry? Olivia, do you want to go first, and then Samantha?
Um, okay, the thing that makes me laugh is I actually was in the games industry when I was 18 and left because I didn't think you could do it as a career. And so when I came back in my mid 30s, I kind of feel like I wasted a whole decade and I could have been learning a load of stuff and just being incredibly senior at this point. But then when I was 18, I worked for IDOS as a QA assistant, and I was the only woman in the department. And like some of the games were awful. I had to play Chris Tarrant, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, every day, several weeks on end, until I decided I was going to pretend to speak Italian so that I could QA the foreign language version because I was about to do murder. But that's where I was initially in it. Then I went to university, tried to do a variety of proper jobs, didn't really like any of them, wanted to get involved in stories, was in publishing editing, and from publishing editing, I moved across to video games editing, by which I mean the text and the story editing, which no one did. So you have things like graphics editors and stuff like that, but like no one actually was someone specialized to look at other people's words and go, well, this is good, this is how you make it better. And so that was my pitch basically to various companies going, you do lots of words, you need someone who can make your words better. This is literally a thing in every single industry, like film, TV, they all have editors. Why doesn't video games? And that's what I got in under. And then I kind of went, also I want to write. So once I was in, I then said, bait and switch, I can do both. And that's kind of my story.
Cool. It's a really cool story. I mean, it's a lot of initiative there and proactivity. So good stuff. What about you, Samantha?
So my background was actually in the tech industry. So I joined IBM as a business consultant back when I graduated from university, and spent a long time working with tech teams and doing a lot of project management and dev management roles. When I'd been there for about 6 or 7 years, I actually went down to part-time work and did a master's in game design because I decided that I wanted to not only shift industry but also change jobs. So I did it sneakily and I did it in stages. So I took all the kind of project management knowledge I had from the tech industry and managed to get a job with Riot Games, who just opened a UK office, literally by emailing the lead European recruiter that I found, being like, "Hey, do you want a dev manager?" And it turns out they did. So it was kind of being in the right place at the right time, but also reaching out and kind of trying my luck a bit. So I basically managed to shift into games, doing obviously falling back on my 6 years experience of project management, and basically became a dev manager producer for games. And then obviously I then started to kind of build out my game industry network. And started telling people that, like Olivia, all along actually I'd want to be a writer. This is just my kind of circuitous path to get there. Yeah, so I started, I joined the Writers Guild and went to a lot of the game writer networking events. I offered to help in Riot to do some of the R&D writing, just basically kind of making friends and learning from people and trying to do what I could. And then I eventually went freelance and started working for Ubisoft as a scriptwriter, and went from there. So yeah, also very indirect.
There's a million routes into the games industry, and there's no correct or wrong
Mhm.
one. So, do you want to just quickly mention the projects that both of you have worked on, or rather that either of you have worked on?
So I kind of pull up my CV. Stuff that I can talk about, because the fun part of the games industry is obviously NDAs, and since games take a decade to come out, it feels like. Fell Better Games, Fallen London, Sun the Sea, Sun the Seas of Mariner, Sun the Skies. Thing that's about, not working on that yet. We got two projects coming up that I will make them let me work on because otherwise I'll cry. So that's with them. Freelance, I've done like a weird, it wasn't Magic Leap, it was one of these AR, not VR things with ants. That was surprisingly interesting. So kind of more of a kind of fact-based thing than fiction. Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, that's interactive fiction. I've done sort of like not the games, but slices of games that people can push them to publishers for things that haven't been published, so you can't talk about them. But like they need scripts. Currently working on a VR thing. lots of stuff where you just go, can't say, did a thing. But yeah, so the main stuff is fail better.
Cool. What about you, Samantha?
So I wrote for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So I wrote the Essex arc for that, and also did a bit of work on the Sussex arc. And then beyond that, I've worked with a few different indie studios. So I've done a bit of writing for a game called Broken Roads, which is an upcoming post-apocalyptic Australian old school RPG, which was really good fun. And I also did some writing for Plague Inc. and Rebel Inc., so working on the updates that came out last year for them. And I currently I'm actually working as a producer at the moment for Adopt Me, but I also do the writing for them when we do a narrative kind of update. So, I'm often writing NPC dialogue or helping them design NPCs. And I did the writing for the Fossil Isle update, which was basically dinosaurs, going back in time and finding dinosaurs, which is always fun. So that was a really interesting event, because whereas everything else I've written for has obviously been a lot of script-based things and games that are kind of coming out and people are playing. With Fossil, we actually wrote for a live event. So we the event itself went out to something ridiculous, like over a million people tuned in to watch it. And kind of played along with it. So it was a really fun thing to be, like, a very different thing to write for. It was a really interesting experience.
That sounds really cool. And I guess this is about getting it into the meat of the topic. So you've talked a lot about different roles, from writer to narrative designer to editor. So what's the overall theme here? And generally, can you talk a bit about what each of these roles does? The roles that you've held specifically.
Here we should define what a narrative designer is. This where I just burst into laughter. Okay, a writer, which is not a narrative designer, could be writing anything from menu text to kind of pick up quest items. So there's little snippets of text you can get in games, to actual dialogue, to quest lines. So that's starting to go towards narrative designer. You can be doing marketing copy if you're in a small company that needs you to do anything. It's like, if there is a word in games, it could have been written by a writer. Sometimes it's written by a coder, sometimes it's written by whoever just happens to be working on that. If you're in a company that's big enough to have writers specialized mainly doing writing, it depends on the type of game. So if you've got a AAA game that has cutscenes, then someone has written those cutscenes, and they'll be written more like a scene play for a film. I think Samantha has more experience with that. Stuff like for Fallen London, basically the whole thing is written by a writer. So that's quality descriptions, quality names, inventory items, level design sentences, so level descriptions, people know yeah. But the difficult and kind of confusing line is the games industry has a title that's called narrative designer, and no one knows what this means. They're better paid than writers, so you want to be one of them, but what is it? And it really depends at companies. So a fair better narrative designer is someone who can work out not just the story as, say, a linear plot, but who can build it in the CMS. So it's not code, it's similar but not code, but also can structure it so it's got branching paths, it's got tokens that pull in other things characters done. At another company, a narrative designer might be very involved with level design, so they might be talking about what kind of visual elements reflect the story that need to be built into the levels. Somewhere else, they're working with audio. It is a strange title, and then you've got people who do kind of economy balancing, and that's also narrative design. So they're saying, if it's Fallen London, you need 20 whispered secrets to get one kind of illicit gossip, that kind of thing. And you don't need to have all those skills to be able to call yourself a narrative designer, but you need to be able to pitch yourself correctly for the company that wants that space filling.
Samantha, anything to add?
Yeah, that was a really good overview, I think. And I definitely, there is a lot of overlap between writers and narrative designers. And I do think a lot of the title of narrative designer is because like having dedicated writers on games is still, compared to the history of game design, is still quite a new idea, right? Like it's you know, a couple of decades ago it would have been very rare to have a dedicated writer on the team. It would have been you know, maybe the creative director did it, or you know, maybe the developers are kind of putting in as you go. And like someone like Rhiannon Pratchett, for example, you know, she's been quite open about the fact that early on in her career, she called herself a narrative paramedic. Like she was brought into a game that was almost ready for production. Like they've got a script in place. It's probably terrible because the writer didn't write it. Often, you know, the narrative didn't match the gameplay and things like that, and she would go in and fix it. So I feel like we're now moving to that point where writers are being brought in earlier, and kind of the craft is being taken more seriously. But I still think there's, you know, if you hear a writer, I think there's a lot of people that are like, oh, I can do that. I write every day. I've got that covered. Whereas I think if they hear the word narrative designer, they think, oh, that sounds, oh, what, I don't know what that is. Maybe I should hire someone to do that. So, you know, I wonder how much of it has kind of come just from desperation of writers to be like, we want to be treated seriously. We want to be involved. Please let us, you know, please bring us in early. Please bring us in as you would a level designer or a, you know, a game designer. But beyond that, there is definitely, like, some of the roles I've done have been kind of pure writing, where, you know, I wouldn't necessarily have much creative direction, or I wouldn't be helping them to build quest or mechanics, whereas others, like, and Ubisoft is a really good example of this, because I worked with a pod basically of myself and two level designers, and we built the arc between us. So whereas I was responsible for, sure, I'd write the scripts, I'd develop the characters, I'd make sure that narratively what we were doing made sense. I had to be in contact with them every day to be like, okay, well, if we're going to go down this narrative path, does that match the gameplay we've got in place? Does that match? Does it fit with the mechanics that are available to us? And vice versa. You know, if the level designers wanted to introduce a new challenge or introduce something different, it was that case of just checking back in with narrative to make sure, again, it made sense, because you want a game that's cohesive at the end of the day. Yeah.
Cool. Before we go further, I just wanted to make a couple of mentions. So first, Olivia, you mentioned the CMS. That's a content management system, right?
Yep.
Uh,
Story Nexus is the one that Fallen London runs on. It used to be public. It's not anymore because it was a nightmare to maintain, because it kept branching and we could only update ours. We couldn't update anything without breaking other people's games. So we're just like, we can't do this. But it basically is a lot of boxes that connect to each other. And in some ways it shares commonalities with things like Twine, in that it would have like a root, a branch, and a result that link together in a way that I guess boxes do in Twine. In other ways, it's just a huge database management system, and all I'm doing is writing in boxes that are slightly nicer to look at than Excel.
And then you also, Samantha, you mentioned Rihanna Pratchett. So I just wanted to mention that on Thursday, we're going to have a chat with Mark Beckler, who works on Lost Words with Rihanna Pratchett. So he's going to talk about production when you're making a narrative game. And then lastly, the last thing that I wanted to say, which which leads us nicely into the next question, is that sometimes, even if you're an established good writer, it doesn't mean that you can write for games. So for example, you know, that was the case when you may have had R.A. Salvatore, who's like a famous fantasy writer who wrote the whole world for an EA game, which wasn't necessarily well received critically. And I wanted to ask you, how is writing for games different than writing a novel or any other sort of text as you would for school? Because at the end of the day, yeah, we are expecting the participants to actually make a narrative game by the end of the month.
Do you want to go first? I'm happy to always steal all good points and leave you the dross like this. Fine, me again, me. So I'm just in a happy mood this evening. Seeing other human faces. Basically, for me there are three main different ways. A lot of games have a degree of interactivity. They're not always branching in that the storyline doesn't always change, but there are points where something you do alters what happens, whether it's just temporarily because you do one quest instead of another. And I think if you're used to writing a book, you don't have to think in the concept of choices. You've made the choice while writing what is the most interesting thing for the hero to do. And so you don't have to constantly think, what's also the second most interesting thing that I can also put in there to make people feel like they have a dilemma. And then it's the concept of the hero, because in a book you have a hero that can have an inner monologue, who can have a personality, you can make mistakes, you can be made a fool of, and players sometimes like to be put in like emotionally difficult situations, but they don't like to be made to feel like they've been made ridiculous. They are the ones making decisions. They don't often like to be told what they're thinking. And so it actually takes away a lot of tools that you have in linear fiction, where you can have, say, the main character go, oh shit, that person's lying. Because it's the thing I'm wrestling with at the moment, is I'm trying to write a story where characters are lying to the player, and quite a lot of my feedback is, but this is confusing because they just said this. I'm like, yes, the inconsistency is oh shit, I'm just confusing the player. So unless you've got an established character like, say, Lara Croft, you're basically having to write a blank slate. But because it's cliche, you're trying to make the blank slate interesting. And I think that's a really, really difficult place there. Those are my points.
Cool. So just to summarize, player choice needs to be taken into account, branching narrative, and the concept of the hero as somebody who doesn't like to be made a fool of, although they may prefer, they may be okay with being put in emotionally difficult situations. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think it's very much as you don't know what the player can think, and you better bloody not tell them what they are thinking.
Okay.
Because even if you're right about what the player is thinking, if you tell them, they'll go, fuck you, no, I'm not. Because people are like that.
Okay. Samantha?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that point of not telling the player what they're thinking, because like it's one of those things that when I do notice it in games, I do exactly that. It's like, well, I'm not thinking that anymore. What are you going to do about it now, game? I suppose looking at it from another angle, like the biggest difference that I find with games writing as opposed to any kind of either novel writing or short story writing or anything is the fact that it is collaborative. So that can be a really strange thing if you're used to writing, you're writing stories in your spare time, maybe you're writing short stories and things like that. You're used to having creative freedom completely, so you can go where you can write things, and then you maybe give it to a friend to read, or you give it to your teacher to mark, or if you're doing it professionally, maybe you've got editors who will feedback on what you've done and help you make it better. But with games, you don't get to do that. You don't get to just go and sit in your room and work for 6 months on a script and then hand it over and be like, here you go, my job is done. It's constantly feeding back on, okay, what if we do this? What if the character does this next? What if the story goes here? And it's being able to change what you're writing as you go as well. So like you have to be good not only at collaborating yourself and advocating for the parts of the story that you think are really important. Because if your focus is a designer and your focus is gameplay and mechanics, and you want to make it fun, you want to make it exciting, if your focus is there, then sometimes the story can drift, or they can cut important parts. And then as a writer or a narrative designer, your job is to say, actually, okay, we can let this go, but this is really important. If we lose this, we're going to lose faith of the players over where the story is going, where the game is going. But it is also it's really difficult, I think, when you're used to writing anything else. It's difficult to have someone come to you and say, no, you can't have that character, or no, you can't have that part of the story. So I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind, is that the story you envisage in your head is probably not going to be the one you end up with, because you've got to take in all these other kind of points of views and all the other people who are making the game with you.
Yeah. So from your end, in addition to what Olivia said, it would be getting constant feedback and collaborating with others on the narrative aspects, as well as needing to cut a lot and negotiate elements of the story with the decision makers, basically.
Yeah.
Stakeholders.
Yeah.
I also wanted to mention that if you do want to chat, you should use the all panelists and attendees option, because otherwise you just get half of the chat, whereas us panelists get all of it. Okay.
I can actually, the thing I said there is someone commented that perhaps the confusion is people aren't used to it because games aren't that mature a medium. Separate tangent is they're quite mature now. Like, they've been out for decades. But I think it's more that games are imperfect, and they're imperfect in a way that players expect to see things go wrong. So if they see something that's confusing or doesn't feel right, the instinct is actually here is a bug, not there's something I'm going to understand if I wait long enough. So maybe it's something that as we develop trust, or if something like develops a reputation of a particular kind of storytelling, they'll be more used to kind of inconsistent and like unreliable stories. But while there are so many other things that can go wrong in a game and do, people are kind of like, oh, this doesn't work. Here's an email going, this doesn't work. And I'm like, it does work.
Mm.
So that's just explaining what was in the chat.
Yeah. So just to kind of bring everybody together as to what we're trying to do and what our goal is with the Elevate by Game Anglia project. The idea is that last week and this week we're doing a series of webinars where we're talking about different bits of making a narrative game or a narrative-driven game, and then on Friday, we're going to be launching 4 kits. These are downloadable templates or forkable templates that the participants are going to use for a story jam between the 19th and 22nd of February, where they're going to make a narrative game using one of the 4 kits, which are going to be Twine, Charisma AI, Ink, and Make Code Arcade. So when you're and then next week and the week after we're going to have 4 workshops going through each of the kits. So I wanted to dive a bit deeper and ask you if there's any common ways to structure a story when you're working with branching narrative, especially when you're looking at the idea of a weekend game jam.
I have 2 important links, of which I only thought to get one up right now.
Okay.
Basically, the first one is from Emily Short's blog, which is the most important blog in the entire games industry, as far as I'm concerned. And it's a blog post that she says is basically for new story game designers, and I still have to check back in because it's just core knowledge. And there's one sentence which is, your job is to make it as hard as possible for the player to finish your game without understanding your story. And I think if that ever gets lost in video games, your story is ruined. I'll put this link in so you can actually read it separately. But so I think the basic way of actually structuring any game, branching or not, is what is the absolute minimum the player has to see to understand what's going on? What is the minimum that will give them a satisfying narrative experience? And the other blog is by Sam Cabo Ashwell. And it's on types of branching narrative. I'm just going to...
For the folks who are watching this on demand, quote unquote, these links should be in the description. If they're not, tweet us at Game Anglia and we'll make sure to add them.
This is quite a longer blog post, but basically it describes types of branching narratives. And I think most people do a game they will never finish as their first game. I know I certainly did, because I was like, here are the amazing ways you can have choices that will all impact the story. And so I started working along all the choices. And by the end of the first introductory chapter, not even like anything beyond the intro, I had something like 20 choices that I would then have to write 20 different storylines for. And I'm like, well, I will close this game and never complete it. Lesson learned. Basically, you can never really divert the story at the beginning. You want to have major choices at a few handful of places at most, and they should be towards the end, or else you're going to be writing like 17 different storylines rather than just 2 with variations. I'd say write one storyline and then find places where it could divert that are equally interesting. So you haven't written the best storyline, you've written one version of it, and look for 2 or 3 places where it could change, but also be pulled back by another choice. It's called bottlenecking. So you have your choices and you pull them back. Sometimes this can feel like you're not making the choice matter. But if you have enough code such that you can track that choice and then say, pull it back later, so it's referenced in a sentence or 2 somewhere, then it can still be really powerful depending on what it's changing. But yeah, my advice is put as few choices in as possible.
Cool. What about you, Samantha?
Yes, so I have my own link that I'm going to share. which is picking up on what you said, Olivia. This is John Ingold, who's one of the co-founders of Ingle. And this is him speaking at Adventure X about exactly that branching narrative and how to do it and how to make it good, basically. It's a really, really good, like 40-minute masterclass. And it shows you that, look, what you just said, Olivia, it kind of shows you that in practice, how you can, especially from a world and flavor point of view, where you can, we've got different kind of players, right? You've got some players who don't really care about the story. They're gonna do what you said, Olivia, that minimum, like just get through the choices as quickly as possible. I don't want to know any of the side stuff. And then you've got people who want to explore more, who want to get to know characters more, who want to learn a bit of the world that's around there. And he shows in that video a really nice way of how you can build that in and how you can build on those loops, so that no matter what path you take, you've still got the information that you need to get to the end. Definitely when you're making a game, like I've just finished, I just did the Global Game Jam that was obviously this weekend just gone. Always aim for less, like take your scope, cut it in half at least, because I can guarantee that you've been over ambitious, because we're all over ambitious. We all want to do a good job and we all have exciting ideas. But just cut that in half and focus on what you've got left. And from a practical point of view, if you find yourself like you said, Olivia, you're at the start and you've got all these ideas and all these branches you can go to. If you're struggling to work out which ones to pick, then something I find often helps is looking at it from the other way around and looking where you want to end at. So look at that end point and where you want to get to, and then work your way backwards. So you've got something you want the player to achieve. So what are 2 or 3 ways that you can get there? And then you can kind of work backwards. And I find that sometimes helps. If the start just seems so big, I don't even know where to go first. I find that sometimes looking at it from that point of view can help to direct my thoughts.
Mm. No, good points. Good points there. And speaking of cutting, I wanted to ask Samantha, how do you cut parts of a story and still keep the core relevant?
Sadly.
Yes, I was going to say so this is one of the obviously the prepared questions, and when I saw it, my first kind of sad thought was normally someone else cuts it for me. Normally, like I'll have worked on contracts, and when I see the game come out several months later, it's like, oh, okay, that character got chopped. It's not. I mean, obviously, it's just the reality of when you're working with big teams and deadlines and stuff that can happen. But yeah, ideally, it's a very give and take thing. I think you tend to go in knowing that not everything you want is going to make it from a narrative point of view. So the way I always think about it is, where am I willing to give, and where do I need to stake my my point in the sand kind of thing. Like, what do I really need to advocate for? What is really, really important to me? And trying to keep sight of that. So then, if something needs to be cut, it's really hard not to look at it emotionally, because you invest a lot as a writer. You invest a lot into the characters you're designing and the things you're coming up with. But the more logically you can look at it, and the more you can kind of say, okay, I really love this character, but they are not important. Like, they are a nice to have. We can get rid of them, and we still kind of keep the core of the story. Because the more you're willing to do that, then when it comes to something that you absolutely, from a writing point of view, you know is really important to the game, I think you're much more likely to get it. If you've shown that you're willing to concede on the things that narratively are nice to haves rather than must haves, then when you get to a must have, I think it gives you a lot more leverage effectively. Because again, we're talking about a negotiation. Because for you to keep something in means that part of the budget gets taken up for something that can't be used on something else. So it's very much negotiation and give and take. Again, from a practical point of view, especially if you're looking at branching, a good kind of very blanket rule of thumb when it comes to cutting stuff is, you want to keep in as much. So think about it of how much is a player going to see. So every player is going to see the stars because everyone goes there. So that's 100% of your player base are reading that first bit. And then it splits into 2. So then you've got 50% of your player base going here, 50% here. And then say each of them splits into another 2. So suddenly you're in a part of the game where only 25% of your player base are going to see it. So that's where you should be cutting. That's where you should be paring down. Well, not should. Should is the wrong word. That's where you can cut. That's the kind of areas that you can look at and go, okay, maybe I won't have a minute-long, fully cinematic cutscene here for the 20% of the players that are going to go on this route. Maybe I'll either front load that or put it at the end if you're going to bring everyone back to the same points. So maybe that's where you can look at making economical design, those bits where that are more niche or fewer players are going to see. But it is always hard, like it's cutting things is always hard.
Mm.
I think there are a few kind of pragmatic things as well. Like, unless you're working at a very small indie studio, you're probably working for a big company or contracting, and you don't own the IP. Try not to give as much shit about the work as you would your own stuff. So, like, if it's your own novel, throw a hissy fit. Probably listen to editors anyway. But like, these are people who are going to profit off the backs of your labor, and don't make things harder for yourself by fighting things that you're not going to win. If you really like aspects of a character, like, fine, cut the character. I'm stealing those aspects and then putting them on who stays. So, or you can reuse them for the future. I mean, if they completely cut the character, you can get away with stealing lots of traits as long as not IP connected and use them for future work. Like, you can create a little folder of things you love that they're not using. Fuck you, I'll use them elsewhere, which I find kind of emotionally comforting. And also time and distance and just stress and fatigue really help you cut things, because, sorry, this is the miserable side of the industry. It's not, I still look for a job. But like in Sunless Skies, we did one area of the game first, and like 2 years later we're about to launch, and look at it and go, some of those bits are not as good as the rest because we've got better at making this game over the last 2 years. So you go back to the beginning going, well, we could rewrite it, or we could just cut this because the game's massive. And so there are bits we just trimmed off, bits that we weren't proud of anymore. And like, at the time that would have really hurt, but like a year later, like, fuck it, kill it, please don't let anyone see what I wrote. That was bad. So if you're lucky enough to be in a position where you have time since you last looked at it, that can really help with cutting.
Cool. No, this is good. I mean, I think in this case, the idea is that everybody's going to make their own games. But the
It's more
advice is,
general,
this is the advice is good, like
Yes.
industry wide. Right. I think I have one more question. Well, we have more prepared ones, but we're gonna go way over on time if we go at this rate. So I'm going to ask folks to send us their questions in while we talk about best practices and tools you use to stay organized.
So who in the games industry does not have ADHD? I have a lot of Slack reminders to actually remind me when things need to be done and put live. Like, I'm incredibly organized because I know that I have no basically functional memory. As soon as someone gives me a task, I'll then set a reminder, which is remind me to do X at Y time. For actually creating things, things like Trellos, where I'll have a list of characters, ideas, possible choices. I find I brainstorm much better on paper, so I have like notepads dedicated to certain projects, and I can always just look through them for ideas, but I can't write on paper because it's so slow, because I touch type faster than I do. So it depends what stage of the project. So reminders, notepads, and then Word docs and organized files. It's probably my way. But there are other things. So there are nice boards, like Notion has a nice kind of, but they all do the same kind of thing, but just nice to look at stuff so you can feel quite pleased with yourself once you've organized it. I need that little boost there. Yeah.
Yeah. I am also highly disorganized. So I tend to find that I do better with writing things down. So especially like task lists. So and I'm obsessive about checking, like, okay, what do I have? What's written on my list? What needs to come off? What needs to be moved? I tried for years using digital tools and just eventually kind of metaphorically threw my computer out the window and was like, I'm buying a notebook, I don't care. So that's how I find like tends to work for me. Having said that, obviously we've talked about the collaborative nature of games, and I can't just send people photos of what's in my notebook for that day. So I on a personal level, I tend to use Trello. It's free to use. It's super simple. I spent years being an Agile coach where I tried loads of different digital boards. And Trello, for I think 90% of people and projects and teams, has everything that you need. Obviously, in different companies, I've used things like Jira, I've used Asana. They're all the same, just with a different UI and a different look to them at the end of the day. And also things like, Olivia, you touched on this before, but we use Excel and Google Sheets a lot more than you probably would expect as writers. It's one of our like most fundamental tools. And it's also a really good way of again, using things like Google, where it is collaborative, so people can see what you're working on, can see the updates, can comment and feedback. It's a lot easier doing something like that in my experience than trying to share around a Word document and tracking changes and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, like like if I put my producer hat on for a moment and speak to you all, my advice is to try loads of different things and see what works, because I think everyone has different ways of staying organized. So just try some different things, try some different boards, try an old-fashioned notebook if you want that, see what works for you, and then all you have to do is find something that will also then work with your team, so that how to, once you've worked out how to stay organized, it's how to communicate to your team that you're organized, I suppose.
Mm.
I'm,
No,
I'm certainly a massive list person, and sometimes I even do lists of lists, which is slightly
Nice.
like at
that's
the
where
morning.
Notion comes in.
At the beginning of every day, I like to write down my tasks for that day, and one of those tasks might be work out what task you need to do to complete this job. So like if it's write a story, one of my tasks would be, well, okay, I need to have an idea, I need to pitch it, I need to then work out how the economy works with this, what parts of law, and like all these nice steps that I can then cross off, which I find really exciting. But yeah, like actually starting every day with this is what you're doing today is great. Even if it's just always port, the first one, cross it out, love it.
Mhm.
Make the first one have a cup of tea and you'll win every single time.
Yeah. From my end, I do my to-do list for the next day at the end of the day, because I find that keeps me from worrying about what I need to do just as I am about to go to sleep. But we have a really good question from Ariel, and this I feel goes back to the idea of having all of those boards with lots of red threads on them and pins. So, what parts of the narrative do you begin with first? Also, do you work around the game mechanics, or do the game mechanics work around you?
Um,
Let's tackle the first bit. What part of
okay.
the narrative do you begin with?
Kind of for fail better, the actual two questions go well together, because say I'm writing an exceptional story, I'm actually thinking, what story can I think of that will have an interesting choice in it, an interesting twist or whatever. And so I am sort of already thinking about the game mechanic is choice based. The player is involved in how the story is shaped, and that sends me looking at the lore doc, going, well, what areas have we not explored that make me excited to think about? So it's kind of pulling all different directions, but that's because it's filling a very specific space. For my freelance work, I'm sort of working around the game mechanics pretty much always, because someone who's hiring a writer or narrative consultant already has an idea of the game they're making. Often they'll have an idea of sort of the story, and depending on how much help they want, they'll let you have a lot of influence on it or not. But it also answers the next question, which is, I think you can have great games with terrible stories, but I don't think you can have stories that are saved by games that are saved by their story if they've got terrible mechanics. Like, because you just get angry. I get really angry playing games when I can't play. And if something is between me and the story, then it doesn't matter how good the story is. If I can't get over that thing, I'm like, there are lots of books. So I don't know. I think most things are mechanics first, but you don't always realize that's what you're thinking about, because I don't always think of choice as a mechanic. I'm just thinking, oh, what will be an interesting story twist? So
Cool. Samantha, what do you start with when you're plotting a story?
So I actually like to start more in the world itself, and with characters if it's a character-driven game. So I like to kind of get a feel for if it's, so for something like Valhalla, I read a lot about Norse mythology, and I watched a lot of things like Last Kingdom, and I kind of did that. Like, I like to immerse myself, I suppose. I like to get that kind of feel for, what do I want this game to feel like? What do I want people to be feeling when they're in that story? And the same with characters. So if it's, because again, quite often if you're freelancing, you probably don't get as much creative freedom as you think you're going to. So it might be that you start with a past narrative that you're told to, or you're given a set of characters and they know what the outcome is, and build it from there. So yeah, I just find that if I feel like I understand the world that we're in, or if I feel a connection to the characters I'm writing, then I start to think, okay, well, how would they act in this world that they're in, and what kind of struggles would they have, and what would be really important to them, and that's then how I kind of build into the narrative. Around the game mechanics, same as Olivia. It's like game mechanics tend to come first, I think, just because by the time they bring writers in, that's already, you've already got an understanding of what you're going to do. So you tend to go in, I think, having a pretty good idea of what the general mechanics are, and also like it's like having a toolkit, I suppose, of stuff you can borrow from. So like I might know that I can do, there's going to be fighting of some kind. So what kind of fighting? Can players be melee? Can they be melee and ranged? Because in that case, we might need some different dialogue. We might need some conditional dialogue in there, depending on what they're using. So yeah, I think it's one of those things, again, like, you might not be explicitly thinking all the time what mechanics are there here, but you are going to have an idea, because you'll be playtesting the game as you go, and you'll be talking to designers, so that will like really inform what you're doing. That's not to say you couldn't do it the other way around. And it would be really interesting. There are some studios who make really great narrative, like heavy narrative games, and it would be interesting. I've never worked for one of those studios, sadly, but it'd be interesting to know, maybe they do things differently. Maybe they do like the Firewatchers of the world. I'm pretty sure they probably start with a pretty solid story and then go, okay, so what mechanics do we need from this?
I do think
Yeah.
that also what we talk about game mechanics, at some level it's incredibly fundamental and basic to world building. So like if you take Cyberpunk, about which there will be mixed feelings, you can say, well, there is shooting, there is hacking, and like, is that game mechanics, or is that we're actually establishing we want to write a game that's set in the future and is sort of sci-fi-ish? At one point, that's probably not going to be a writer setting. That's a very high level creative direction. But like, if you don't know those game mechanics, you don't know what world you're writing, and then it's just pick what game you're writing. It could be anything. So at a very basic level, you need to know, well, is this a shooter? Because if you then start writing something like a Monopoly game, you're lost.
You can have NeoCab on one end and Cyberpunk on the other, and they're both Cyberpunk in terms of setting, right? A question from Michael. As a writer, you're bound to hit a roadblock when you build and structure a story. My question is, how do you get out of that creative block?
Scream. In my case, ask my colleagues. I'm incredibly lucky who I work with, and I can just go, I'm dying over here, please help me. If I was trying to do it on my own, I'd go for long walks. I would try and write what the opposite of that thing is and see if that fits instead. And if it's completely ludicrous, see if there's anything there that I can use almost ironically. Cut it. Like, you're always looking for things to cut in games. I'm stuck, cut this shit. Like, there are ways, but generally the best way is always ask for someone else's opinion, because it might not be as bad as you think it is. But even if it is, the problem isn't probably what you think it is, because you're too close to it. Someone might go, yeah, you're right, it's wrong, but it's not because of this reason. And as soon as you see that not, then you can solve things. But you need to have people you can trust to give good feedback, but also honest feedback, because there's no point someone being nice to you. There's also no point someone being horrible to you, because what are you going to learn from that?
Yeah. What about you, Samantha? How do you get out of a creative rut?
Yeah, I'm a big advocate for a walk. Like, get out of the house, get away from the screens, get some fresh air. Or, I hate to say it, but also the gym, I find, works, as much as I hate going there. It's just anything where you're like, remove yourself from screens. Basically, we're surrounded by them. It's really easy to think, well, I'll have a break, I'll go and sit on the sofa and have a cup of tea, and then if anything like me, you're on your phone without even really realizing it. So just go somewhere different, get a change of scenery, get some fresh air, because your brain will be working in the background. Like, you might be looking at the dog and eating an ice cream, or whatever it is that you do when you go out on your walks, but your brain will be kind of puzzling through the issue as you go. And it's definitely something that's helped me before. Like, I think it is one of those things as well that you'll start to recognize, like, the more you do it and the more you kind of work on games and you work in these scenarios, the more you'll be able to recognize your own patterns. So you can get to a point where it's like, oh wait, I'm actually stuck here. I haven't realized I'm stuck because I feel like maybe I'm being productive because I'm actually going around in circles. But as soon as I recognize that now, it's okay, I'm going to go outside, I'm going to go for a walk.
Hmm.
um yeah.
Cool.
Otherwise, I don't know if it's probably not good advice, but especially if I'm stuck around something around solving a narrative puzzle or struggling with dialogue or something, I will sometimes write a scene or two as if it is written in prose. So as if like if this was a novel, how would I do it? I think that's just because like I didn't start writing games. I started like a lot of people do, like writing prose and writing short stories and kind of wiggled my way across. So I find that sometimes it's still, when my brain is tired or when I'm stuck on something, it's a different kind of narrative lens to look at things through.
Hmm.
Um, so probably, I mean, for some people that just wouldn't work. I find for me, it just helps unstick me sometimes just to go and write a page of free form writing about the characters, if this they were in a book or a different kind of medium.
Interesting. That's a really, really interesting piece of advice.
Sort of a related, but not quite. If one of the problems is exposition or characters talking about their feelings too much, the easiest cheat is to get another character to be worried about the person who would otherwise be doing exposition or talking about their feelings. So if character now is no longer talking about their feelings and saying they're fine, and someone else going, look, sorry, I don't want to draw you into this, but I'm really worried about it because this happened to them. Do you think you could talk to them? It's suddenly slightly more convincing than someone going, I'm in a bad mood because my sister died in a car accident. Just someone else telling a gossip, someone who cares, like step back from the character you actually want to talk about and have someone else talk about them is just a cheat.
It's an interesting, an interesting tip. So a question from Ori for Samantha: do you ever apply Agile to your work now? Asking of the producer in games.
That's a great question. Sometimes I think so, yeah. So I think so what I've learned, and I could talk about Agile, that's a whole other talk, obviously, but I've been doing it for years. And something that I've learned is that I think most people, when they're working in very small groups, work in an agile way without even necessarily knowing that's what it was. Just because I think when you're in a small group, so again, taking the game jam at the weekend, for example, there was myself and two friends of mine. We've made small games together. We were at university together, so we know that we work together well, and we all have our own roles that we're doing. And when there's only three of you, it's really easy to stay in touch. So it's really easy to constantly update people on, I'm doing this now, I've gone in this direction. What do you think of this? Can you play test this? Am I going mad? Does this still work? All those kind of things. Um, and that is being agile. Like agile is all about visibility, transparency, communication, inspecting what you're doing, adapting it, making it better, iterating. That gets lots harder when suddenly you're a studio of 200, right? Because how do you do that? How do you build in those communication levels? And that's when, from a professional point of view, if I'm there as a producer, that's my job. My job is
Good
to put them
producers are
in.
gods. They're literally lifesavers. There's a difference between like everyone burning out on a game not coming out on
Mm-hmm.
time, a game being shit, a game being broken. Like
Yeah,
good producer, a bad producer can break a game. A good producer can make a game. That's
absolutely agree.
yeah.
Absolutely agree. It's a really hard job. I much prefer writing. Writing is much easier. And when I am doing a pure, like I've done a few jobs recently that have been a hybrid role. So I've done a bit of both, which is always good fun, like balancing that. But like when I'm doing a pure writer role, I'm not necessarily actively using agile. I probably use a lot of agile techniques just because they've been drilled into me. I've done them for such a long time. But I do find myself going into that deep focus where suddenly I look up and realize I haven't spoken to anyone for 5 hours and I've made these two really important narrative changes and maybe I should check with somebody. Which is again where having a producer is great because then they can give you that little tap on the shoulder and go, oh hey, do you want to grab a coffee and let's talk about where you've gone and where you're going, to bring it back. So yeah, I think most people work agilely without realizing it when they're in small groups. And it's certainly something that, because I've done it for such a long time, I think it comes more naturally to work in that way than not.
We kind of get agile applied to us, which is
Hmm.
much better. But
Yep.
also on the whole communicating all the time. Communicate all the time except when you shouldn't. We actually have some of our more senior writers who are offline 2 days a week, and every writer is offline Fridays just to get your head down and write. And it's because while we were talking all the time, making sure everyone knew what was everyone up to actually write, sometimes you need to be focused for 5 hours and going, right, here is a problem, I'm going to write it, I'm going to deal with it and think it all through. And there is some study somewhere is that anytime someone interrupts you, even if it's just like for one question, it takes a good 15 minutes to get back into what you're doing before, and it's a massive waste of time. So like while we have tasks and the producer being a brilliant human being, like make sure at the beginning of every 2 weeks we know who's dependent on who needs what by when, and what will impact on other people's work. Sometimes we just go dark, and so we can actually get the work done. So yeah, it depends what kind of work you're working on, I think.
I am mindful of the time, and we may not be able to go through all of the questions. But if we don't, I'm going to write them down, and we're going to send you answers to them by the beginning of next week, I want to say. So we have a question from Mark. In terms of a starting point, when you have a lot of interesting ideas and you don't know which to choose, what kind of approach would you take to choosing one of the ideas or multiple of them?
I feel like this is something that probably depends on what kind of game you're building and who you're building it with and what kind of situation you're in. So the easy answer, if you're in even a small group or a small studio, whatever, is go to the people you'll be building it with and saying, I've got all these ideas, all these different narrative themes. What do you think is interesting? Do any of them sound really interesting? Do any of them spark any interesting like quest ideas or level design ideas? And get that feedback from the team. Because then obviously, you're taking a holistic view and you're getting other people's influence. Which is really useful. If you're building a game by yourself, however, I think this is where you can get to that point where you have so many choices and so much options that sometimes it's easier just not to do it, which is a really bad place to be in. And I think we've all probably been there as writers, that kind of like, I don't know which bit to focus in, so I'm going to stop. So I suppose, again, it depends on maybe the narrative isn't the only thing you're interested in. Maybe you want to write a game by yourself, you want to do the writing, but you also want to practice your pixel art. In which case, are there any ideas that that you've got narratively that also spark some really exciting ideas for an art direction? Or maybe you are doing development as well, and you really want to make a platformer. So in that case, are any of these narrative ideas something that that you can imagine fitting really well with that? So yeah, I suppose I'd recommend, like, obviously collaborating and talking to other people, especially if you're building it with them, because then you'll be able to get different insights and views you may not have considered. And if it's just you, look at it through some other lenses as well, because I think it's very rare that the only thing you want to do is write. You probably want to try a different genre, or you want to write a particular theme, or you want to go with a particular aesthetic. So yeah, I just see what fits the other things on your wish list, which ones match up the best.
I think
What
also
about you, Olivia?
making sure you're not tempted by the other ideas, because every project gets really hard at some point. And if at that point you go, oh, I could just do the other thing instead, well, then you're doomed. So even if it's just saying, I'm going to pick one of these ideas, and it doesn't actually matter which, but you just decide to stick with it, that's one option, as long as you make sure you do stick with it. Because you can always make other games in the future. There's nothing going, this is your one, this is the only game. Or alternatively, I'd put aside an hour and put down all your ideas in columns, use a nice little Trello and go, which can I think of mechanics for, which can I think of an ending for? Because you might have an interesting idea for a start, but if you can't think of an ending for them, you're like, okay, I can't immediately think of endings for these two. These are the ones where I can easily see the start and the end, which has best mechanics, and make it easy for yourself. Like, which do you have the most ideas for all aspects of it, and then go with that. But whatever you do, don't cheat on it once you started, or you are doomed.
And then I think this one's going to be the last one or next to last one that we take. And it's actually two questions which are similar. So the first one is from Judah about how to write, how hard is it to write an original narrative that's never been done before? And the second one is from Ariel. Do you avoid materials like books, games, movies, or shows that are similar to what you're currently working on to avoid being influenced, or do you seek those materials out for inspiration? So do you want to talk a bit about originality and getting like inspired?
There is no such thing as an original story. I like it comes down to exactly what degree you break it down to, but there is a hero arc or whatever. A lot of the writing advice books have kind of been debunked. You can write it your own way, but ultimately there isn't an original story. It's either a hero is saved, a hero is doomed, there is love, there is no love. There are some very basic components of basically being a human being, and most stories are about that. It's about how you tell the stories and how you make people relate to those involved them, and whether the person who's either playing or reading them gives a shit. And beyond that, like, stressing about originality is probably the least of your worries, because that's not what's going to get a person hooked. If people are, say, reading what's his name, the Chicago magician book fantasy series Dresden Files, they're also going to love the Alex Verus. They're going to love the Aronovich books. People read in genres. Same with games. Same with any stories. If people like one style of story, they will like more of the same, because it's like tasting food. So don't worry about originality. Worry about how you can make your version of that a really good version of it. I can't remember the second part of the story. Oh, yeah, I tend to read the kind of things I want to write, but then I force myself to diversify, because growing up, I read a lot of science fiction fantasy, but it tended to be all written by old white men. Not all of it bad, some of it incredibly good, but I just didn't have access to some of the brilliant things. Particularly, I like to read, I think it's African futurism and Afrofuturism, because I have no access to that for my own personal culture, and I find it incredibly inspiring, even though I would never dare write it myself. But it gives me ideas that I can then bring back to my own kind of stuff. It's fine to read your own stuff, as long as you're making sure that the band of it is not too narrow.
Samantha, what are your takes on this?
I definitely agree over originality. Like, yeah, there's lots of stuff. Like, you can go and Google, is there an original story, and you'll get lots of excellent articles that explain no, really, which I don't think is a bad thing. And I think, echoing a lot of what Olivia said, there's a reason that authors like Stephen King are really prolific. It's not because people want a different kind of story. They want horror. They want to go and read horror. And especially looking from a cultural point of view, genres are genres for a reason. Like, there's things that you go into that knowing what's going to happen. There are certain, like, psychological schemas that we have that tell us that, when all the lights start to flicker in a darkened hallway and the radio goes staticky, probably something bad's going to happen. And I think that's part of what attracts people to those things. So I wouldn't worry too much about originality, because the very fact that some stories aren't original is actually what draws people to them. And just to add on that, though, I think one thing that that we're seeing a bit more and more in games now is the idea of playing with originality and playing with those genres and twisting them. So am I allowed to spoil games here? I'm going to do it anyway. If you haven't played Firewatch and you don't want spoilers, close your ears now. But a game like Firewatch really plays with that idea of the horror genre, and it really, really builds into it, so that you think something terrible is going to happen and you're ready and you're on edge the entire time, and then you kind of get to the end and none of that happens. So I think if you want to tell, if you want to look at originality, then my advice would be look at subverting the genres rather than trying to come up with a new story. Look at what's expected and maybe how you can play with that in a fun way. I've also forgotten the second part of the question.
I have remembered a second bit though about it. Like,
Oh.
it was about whether you should read within your
Yes.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
What you should absolutely read is very interesting non-fiction. So, like, if you can find a book that delves into really obscure things to do with mushrooms, or bring it all the way back to, are you ancient if you like looking at concrete? Like, if you walk around towns, you look at the water plates in different towns of manholes, they'll have prints on them and patterns that are about companies that no longer exist for about 100 years, whatever, because they've been around for a long time. And these are facts you can absolutely steal for world building, and they're fascinating. Like the history of rat catchers in Victorian London. Any weird shit like that that's really, really specific and niche, and someone's gone into a whole load of depth, you can just plunder it for ideas that are brilliant for stories. So if you can read really specific nonfiction, that's great.
Definitely. And So I definitely do read a lot of materials if I'm working in a certain genre or time period or whatever, especially if it's one I'm not really familiar with. I will read a lot of stuff around it. I try not to just stick with one thing. So I'd rather read shallowly across a lot of things than go deeply into like one film or one TV show or whatever. And I think that helps you then kind of not copy something, not inadvertently kind of plagiarize something very specific. It gives you a more wider view. Um, and one bit of advice on that, following on from what Olivia said, is when we're allowed out again and it's safe to be out, going to museums is brilliant, especially in London. Go to the British Museum and take photos of everything you think is interesting. Take photos of the little explanation cards about what certain cultures use for currency or whatever, because they are the kind of things that could spark future game ideas. Um, yeah, like we've all got phones on us now as well, so make notes, take photos, even do voice recordings if that's useful, and just kind of start building up your own bible, I suppose, of interesting lore and culture and art and anything that you can find in your day-to-day lives, because they're the kind of things that it might be 10 years from now, but you might suddenly think, oh wait, now I went to that museum that one time and there was a really cool exhibition, and somewhere I've got a photo that explains it, and maybe that's going to be like a great hook for a game that you make in 5 years time.
That's a really really cool way of putting it. Thanks a lot for that. So yeah, as I said, I am very mindful of the time. We are running over a bit, and we do have quite a lot of questions remaining. So if both of you are okay, what I've done is I've copied the questions that we currently have into a Google Doc that I'll share with you, and then you can write the answers there. And we are going to add a link to the Google Doc together with the link to the recording on the Game Anglia Elevate website at some point soon, and then we're gonna publicize that on Twitter, so folks can get the answers. Most of the questions that we had, by the way, are mostly around collaborating with other writers, as well as specific game related questions and questions regarding getting started there as a narrative designer. So
Mhm.
um, yeah, and then I just want to close with the last question that we had prepared, which was for somebody who's about to write their first story for a game or make their first narrative game. What's one piece of advice or what's some advice that you have?
Panic. Sorry. Think small. Um, if you're not going to build a massive AAA game, you're building something small, and therefore your story should be small to do it justice. At least for me, I appreciate kind of the intimate personal details in a game, and the bigger it is, the more broad sweeping you have to be. And small is nice. People are interesting.
Samantha?
Um, I would say have fun with what you're doing. Like, don't for your first game, don't go out of your comfort zone. Do what you love. If you love fantasy games, write a fantasy game. Don't worry about trying different things or trying to teach yourself a whole new subject to be able to write a game. Just pick something that you're already passionate about, because that's where the best stories come from, is when we have passion and when we have fun doing them.
Cool. Thank you so much for that. From my end, it's just like keep it small. The idea is to make a game and to use a kit that other folks have helped put together for you over a weekend. For some of you, it might be the first time you're making a narrative game. For others, it might be the first time you're making a game. So allow yourself room for error. We are going to we are going to have a facilitator or two available to help you in terms of game development in and of itself and making a game during a game jam, but they might not necessarily know how to troubleshoot your twine game or your ink game per se. So yeah, keep it small and prepare for it to take about 4 times as much as you would expect it to take. And yeah, as Samantha said, cut and then cut again. Right.
And test early. Do not leave that to the end.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And with that being said, I will remind you to fill in the attendee, the post-event survey that's going to pop up as we end this talk. I'm going to stop recording now, and we'll see you all on Thursday, hopefully, for our chat with Mark Backler talking about the production of narrative-based games in a game studio. I'm going to stop recording now.